This video was sponsored by NordVPN. The dream had failed. After so many years of revolution and casting away the reins of the Spanish Empire, Simón Bolívar died alone. The state that he had envisioned had fractured between different rulers, corruption was rampant, the economy in turmoil, and the divisions of the population could not be overcome. Gran Colombia had collapsed. So, here's an idea. What if Gran Colombia had survived? Bolívar was complicated. He modeled his new nation and even others on a modern way of thinking, but he also placed himself at the head of everything. In a way, you could call him a dictator. The military kept Gran Colombia together, yet it also sapped it of much-needed funds. In summary, he was a revolutionary. And like many revolutionaries, they can sometimes fly too close to the sun, only to be remembered fondly later for the positives. So that said, Gran Colombia was a massive endeavor, and in most ways, a pipe dream. Its territory encompassed what's now 3 South American nations, and with that, there are a few underlying issues. 1. Race. The Spanish caste system had created disparity. Racial boundaries still kept the country from being fully united. 2. Geography. Its borders encompass rainforest, mountains, rivers, and extended from sea to sea. Such geographic divisions lead to fracturing and are difficult to control. 3. Corruption and infighting. Rival politicians, generals, and revolutionaries often undermine Gran Colombia, leading to a split in the government between insurrection, federation, or centralization. 4. Money. As with any revolution, war is expensive. The nation was in debt immediately after its foundation, and corruption didn't help. So when imagining an alternate timeline where Gran Colombia did somehow survive, it comes with the baggage that many of these problems would be a mountain to overcome, in some parts literally. One change I could imagine that would help is that Bolívar actually remains around the capital during the infant years of the nation. While it was still gaining its footing, Bolívar was off in Peru fighting against remaining Spanish loyalists, leaving his VP in charge. Had he stayed, perhaps that charisma and direct leadership would have kept factions from splitting off. This is just an example, but my point is to say Bolívar focuses on consolidating power and energy instead of trying to expand the revolution. Whatever it may be, somehow by the skin of its teeth, Gran Colombia survives an alternate 1820s as a legitimate, centralized state. Simón Bolívar would have not lived that long to see his nation continue further. He was already dying of disease, and no change in the timeline would have prevented him from succumbing to this. It's likely with Bolívar's death, the debate is ended. A more loose constitutional republic is established instead of the central state that Bolívar wished for. Gran Colombia would certainly not be a state to sneeze at. By the 1840s, its capital of Caracas would be larger than many notable US cities, and it would control an area larger than Western Europe, the same distance from Washington, D.C. to Nebraska. As for international recognition, the US recognized Gran Colombia by 1824 of our timeline. Europe, however, would take far longer to do so, considering everyone's relationship with Spain. Declaring a rebel government as independent would hurt relations with the Spanish, at least for a few more decades until Spain reluctantly agrees, leading to new economic opportunity and trade with nearby colonies of the British and French. Relations with most of South America would be cold at best. Brazil would be much more protective of their northern border, considering there's now a bigger threat. Peru would be more connected to Argentina than with Colombia. I could imagine perhaps a 3-way rivalry between the North, West, and East. But with that said, South America, compared to other continents, has always been far more peaceful, at least considering wars between nations. As well, conflicts in South America are much more intra than extra. When the military is often used, it's to suppress revolutions and protest. Gran Colombia would operate probably the same way, using its military to keep itself together and deal with any issues that it has. And these would be issues that would still exist even by the 20th century, ones that could be exploited by, say, outsiders, not from South America. We all know that by the late 19th century, the US was certainly Monroe-doctoring their southern neighbors. Those banana republics aren't gonna supply dole themselves. The difference is now by the turn of the 20th century, there would be a large South American state, most likely having trouble keeping some sort of stability even after all this time, in control of one of the most valuable strips of land in the world. The US would most likely exploit some internal division within Colombia itself to distract Colombia long enough to move on in and lay claim to the Panama Strip, sending in their navy to keep any Colombian forces at bay. Panama is declared independent, recognized by the Americans, but not by Colombia, who fully mobilizes with a much larger military. What in our timeline was a land swipe against a weaker nation becomes a larger international event between two competitors. Colombia is sending much more men up north to attempt to crush the rebels and force the Americans out, making the acquisition of this land a far bloodier and difficult affair for the US. If Colombia loses this, which they most likely would, the loss of Panama remains a stain that forever sours relations between the US and Colombia. During the Bolivian Revolution, Gran Colombia offered weapons and support to Cuban, Dominican, and Puerto Rican revolutionaries against the Spanish. Colombia in retribution might easily take the mantle as the bulwark of Latin American independence and the antithesis to American imperialism. Much like Cuba of our timeline, this far larger nation would supply weapons, revolutionaries, and training across the region to encourage rebellion. Considering how events such as World War I and World War II occurred in the Old World, I'm going to go off on a limb and say that even if Gran Colombia still survived, modern history would most likely not change. Meaning that by the end of World War II, we have the start of the Cold War. That anti-Americanism that Colombia has manifests into sympathy with the Soviets. Latin America in the Cold War sure was something, and the same story would be said in this alternate Gran Colombia. Colombia in some way becomes the new hotbed crisis of this alternate Cold War. Not only is it next to one of America's most vital economic and military locations, but the land of Venezuela sits upon one of the largest oil deposits in the world. The Cold War is where the tension between Colombia and the US finally comes to a head. Perhaps the government voluntarily elects a socialist government spurred on by anti-Americanism. Perhaps the US in response props up a far-right dictator. Rebellion occurs. Regions fall to various factions. Arms supplied by both sides of the Cold War. The nation might easily descend into violence and chaos, might explode into an alternate American intervention in the New World. Whatever weak binds held Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador together collapse. Local capitals taking sides. Communists and rebels taking refuge in less populated jungles in the interior. Other allied nations to the US perhaps even getting involved militarily, such as Peru, which would still have border disputes with Colombia. The Peruvian regime being propped up as a wall against communism. Who knows, maybe Gran Colombia, after surviving the 19th century, could continue into the 20th without some massive bloodshed. It could simply pull in Argentina with a far-right dictator, dissidents silently killed. Had Gran Colombia survived, it would be an oil-rich nation, a land of differences and challenge, but remaining what Bolivar envisioned it to be. A nation large enough to deflect the incursion of empire. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub. Want to prevent distant nations from influencing where you live? While you may not personally be Simón Bolívar, you can try to protect your home in one small way, by protecting your identity online with NordVPN. This video's sponsor. Nord is a virtual private network, one that you can use while browsing on your computer or handheld to hide your IP address and make sure that no bad actors get a hold of your personal information online. It's simple to use. Just boot it up. Pick from thousands of servers in 60+ countries and go on your way. If you want to try out Nord, you can sign up using the link in the description, nordvpn.com/althist, and use the code ALTHIST to get 70% off a 3-year plan plus 1 additional month free. In this fantastic year of 2020, there isn't much any of us can do about the current state of the world, but some things like your personal information, you can keep stable. Once again, just click the link nordvpn.com/althist to have some peace of mind on the internet, even if the internet is as toxic as ever.